You are listening to Spiritual PTSD. I'm Damian Skinner, a recovering exorcist and Christian. The stories you are about to hear are all first-hand true life encounters I experienced as a child and later teen exorcist and miracle worker. As a tongue-talking, spirit-slaying, word and faith child minister, I personally performed well over 75 exorcisms before the age of 18. Many of these stories are horrific in nature, many hilarious, but all are embarrassing. This podcast is for adults only, as these stories are disturbing, and I do like to say the word fuck a lot. I am sitting out in the middle of a park. I'm in my car. Unfortunately, I do have to have my engine on. Not just because I need air conditioning, but also because I'm running power off of my through my car and all that good stuff. I've been out here for a while recording podcasts. I did just find out that the last podcast I just recorded, I didn't have the mic turned on, but my recorder recorded it, but it just sounds like shit. So I'm a little bit pissed off about that. However, in today's episode, I wanted to talk about oh boy, Clarence. Now, it's 6th grade, and I've not really talked about the poverty aspect, the poor aspect of my childhood. In many ways, it was, I would say, equally or a very close second responsible for any of the trauma that I talk about on this podcast. You know, I would easily say religion was number one. But religion mixed with no money, you know, man, it's just one of those chemical combinations that really makes it more acidic. It erodes faster. It eats. It's a little bit more bite to it, you know. I mean, I've been around a lot of Christians who had a shit ton of money. And a lot of them are good people. But the ones that I had been around, and I mean multi-millionaires, they were basically business people who were Christians versus Christians who were business people, if that makes any sense. Like if it got really down to it, it was just business. But their money did a lot of good. Their money helped on missions and things like that. And so for me, you know, I've seen that, and of course Jesus had things to say about the difficulty of being, you know, particularly wealth or money in particular, not wealth, but money driven, and having a great deal of that, and how hard it is to follow his teachings. So for me, growing up, we grew up pretty poor, especially the early childhood. You know, I don't know how you define poor in America. I've been to a lot of third world countries. And I always need to say these things because I would be mortified if somebody ever thought that I grew up with this horrific childhood. And I know that sounds contradictory to maybe the entire point of this podcast, but you know, I am starting to get to a place where people are hearing some of these podcasts, and I am starting to get feedback from people that aren't, you know, particularly happy. Some of them that have heard, they know the people, or I was talking about them in particular. And, you know, what you have to understand and what you have to realize about this is what I'm trying to communicate is what my perspective and how I received things that happened. Now, that doesn't mean that I made up in my mind being slapped in the face. I didn't make that up. That happened. But what I did with that, the impact of that, what I saw with that, and this isn't even I'm not saying it's my fault. Fuck that. That's abusive Southern wife bullshit. Like, well, I made him mad, so he slapped me. No, motherfucker. I didn't deserve any of that shit. I didn't ask for it. Maybe on some spiritual level, I, wanted it in this round of life, if we want to get all metaphysical with it. Outside of that, no. I didn't want any of this shit. I didn't ask for it. So I'm not saying that I'm responsible and I have to take responsibility for it. What I am saying is that if the exact same set of circumstances happen to 10 different people, we would all agree that it's wrong to do those things to all 10 people. But all 10 of those people would have varying different experiences. And my experience being a being a very, how do I say this? Being a very lucid dreamer. I wasn't just the daydreaming kid that like wanted to doodle, even though that was a big part of it. And it certainly was a huge part of my brother's. He was amazing at it. I would go for just long periods of time and not really know where I was. And I've tried to explain this to people before, and, you know, most people don't really know what I mean by it. Therapists say that that's how you describe your childhood now because of trauma. And I get that. But there were times that I can remember telling people when I was a kid, I don't remember what I've been doing or where I've been for the last couple of days. And people looking at me like, what? I said it one time, multiple times to my parents. I said it one time to my youth pastor, Sean Wynn, who was hilarious, and I don't think he took me seriously, which, you know, I mean, why would you? It's a weird one. But I specifically remember saying it, which brings me to the story today, to Ms Dendy. So the first day of 6th grade. Now remember, 6th grade, you are definitely giving a shit about what kids are thinking at this point. All right, you have left booger eating behind. You are on your way to masturbating and humping and trying to, like, you know, wear the right clothes. And so, first day of school, everyone goes around and says, you know, what they did for summer and what they're excited about for this school year. And so you'd hear the typical, you know, we went on vacation here and we did this and we did that. And, you know, when it got to me, I remember, I'm so embarrassed when I think about this. I remember saying, you know, I hung out, went to church camp this summer and, you know, blah, blah, blah. And then I remember looking at Ms Dendy saying, I don't really remember going to school the last couple of years. And I've never really understood why I was supposed to be going to school, but I feel like I kind of get it. And I'm really excited just to, like, kind of, you know, be here this year. And everyone's looking at me like, what the fuck? I mean, I was in 6th grade. And so I always had this kind of like time slipping in and out of consciousness kind of a behavior. And yes, I know I remember my childhood that way because of things, but I also was experiencing it when I was a child, if that makes sense. And so in the same year, 6th grade, we were poor, like broke ass, dick poor. Now, the way I define poor as an American is different, obviously, than poor on the global scale. You know, I've been to Cambodia. I've been in the horrible parts of Mexico. I've been to Vietnam. I've been to different places. I've been to Africa. I've served. I've fed. I've been to orphanages. I know what poverty, I've seen it. Now, let me correct that. I've seen poverty. That does not mean I know what it is, because that's some bullshit. I've never lived off of clumpy, cold-ass rice with bugs in it my whole life. So for us, in comparison, you know, we're living in kind of a country suburb of Dallas at the time. You know, it's Allen. My parents are still there. I've lived there pretty much my whole life, other than a stretch in L.A. You know, there was an affluent part of Allen. It certainly is now. It's a very wealthy city now. Has a $68 million football stadium for its high school. So I was always going to school in clothes that were either way too small, because I'd been wearing them for years, or way too big because they were my brother's, and my brother's 5 years older than me. So when I'm in 6th grade, Shannon had already gotten a job. Shannon, my older brother, that dude has worked his ass off from, I mean, as early as I can remember, he was mowing yards, raking, doing anything he can. And as soon as he was able to get a hardship, not license, but a hardship, whatever it was, he was allowed to get a job at Brahms, I think at 13 or 14. Dude, he was there. And he's been working like a fool ever since, not in a negative sense, working his ass off. So, point of that is he started having new clothes, like hip, current kind of clothes, right? And, you know, 6th grade for me was 1987, I think. This is the same year that I sang I've had the time of my life from Dirty Dancing to the entire class on the last day of school. I was a fucking weird kid, man. But I sang it with other people too. I wasn't the only one, so we were all fucking weird. But back on point, I'm really trying. Sorry, my brain is pinging a lot. It's because I'm sitting in a park. There's a million distractions, which is not good. So I was always going to school with like really bad clothes. You know, the holes in the jeans, and then my mom would patch them. And you guys know the old school patch. I mean, it didn't match. You could see it's humiliating. There wasn't the cool hole in jeans thing going on at this time. I couldn't pull that off, you know. And I was already learning from my dad because my dad was always so fucking hilarious. My dad would always turn any of the poor stuff into bits, into jokes, and he was hilarious at it, man. So I grew up watching my dad deal with poverty, and again, I keep saying I'm going to define poverty. You know, we would go for long stretches without electricity. We went years without a phone. You know, we had for years and years, we had to, you know, go get food from the community shelters and clothes from the community shelter. Churches would give us, you know, we lived a lot off of what my parents would call miracle money, which is you go out to get the mail and somebody has come by and put, you know, cash. It was always cash. You know, Christianity runs on cash. That's not a they care too much about money statement. That one should be obvious to you by now. But I mean, literally it runs on cash. And so, you know, we used to have what we call the Holy Ghost handshake, where you go up, you know, typically after service because you don't want to be weird. You know, and you go up to shake this is a guy thing. You go up to shake some guy's hand, but what you do is you roll a 20, 100, whatever you're going to bless them with, you roll it in their hand, and you go up and you shake them, and then you know, do the deal, right? Like it's like a drug deal method, but with cash. And you're blessing them, and then they look back and they look down. It's kind of a cool thing because they're doing it because, you know, there's a lot of people around. Everybody's hugging out, and, you know, and so it's kind of just a way you started getting used to going out to your mailbox, and there'd be, you know, $100 in there with a letter. You know, God told me to give this to you or whatever. And we lived that way. Not that my dad wasn't working, not that my dad didn't have a job, and not that my dad didn't work hard. That's a whole other conversation for another podcast. My dad worked his ass off and does to this day. Oftentimes we confuse poverty with laziness because that seems to make sense. You know, if you're lazy, you're not going to have anything or whatever. And certainly that's true. But there are other causes and there are other things. And with my parents' situation, a lot of it was lack of education. And I don't mean official education, because my dad went to an accredited Bible college, Bethany Bible College in Santa Cruz, California. That's where I was born, was when my dad was in Bible college. My dad understood a lot of things. He had he still does have a fantastic vocabulary. He's very well spoken. That's where I get my speaking, my articulation from and all that. However, they never learned to challenge assumptions. So if they had heard that, you know, they need some work on their teeth and that's going to be $2,000, $3,000 and we can't afford that, they would just never go to the dentist. That's it. You know, I was told my whole childhood, just don't even think about going to college. College starts at $220,000 a year. Now, while that might be true for some places today, which is ludicrous, it wasn't true then. It's barely true now. And then after I graduated high school, when everybody else was going into their freshman year of college, even if it was just community college, I started looking around. I'm like, all you broke fuckers are going to school. How did you do this? And everyone's looking at me like, grants, scholarships, like what the fuck? I was a senior before I ever knew what a GPA was. Not what my GPA was. Before I even knew that existed. I had no idea, and I was a senior in high school. So we experienced a lot of different kinds of poverty, lack of education, and there was a lot of contradictions. So my parents were really drawn to the prosperity message. If you're not familiar with the prosperity message, do a quick Google search, go to videos, watch a few of those, you'll get it. It's a crossover, and a lot of times it gets confused with like the healing evangelist, and there's overlap because it's, money. But prosperity message on its own is that God wants you to have mansions, jets. He wants you to live in luxury, because by living in luxury, it is a testimony to his goodness. And then they start going through scripture and showing what they can twist, like you can any scripture, into proof that not that God is okay with wealth, which, I think some denominations and some religions should probably teach that a little bit more. If you're going to stick to the whole God's in control of your life aspect of ideology, then you probably should open it up so people have a chance, But on the flip side, it's such a bastardization of the scriptures, especially when you look at how Jesus lived his life. And so it's this huge, hypocritical, weird world. And what it attracts, it doesn't attract wealthy people. It's like a MLM. And man, people get antsy when I start talking about MLMs. But guys, there's a reason why the majority of MLMs overlap with churches and Christians. There's a reason for that shit. And yeah, there's some practical ones. There's social models of how you connect with people and who you're going to pitch and who you're going to, bring into your left leg or your right leg or whatever the fuck. But there's also another aspect, and that is that on the prosperity side, and where there is a lack of knowledge, I shouldn't say education, where there's a lack of knowledge, education was some of it, but knowledge of knowing how things work and how things happen, and the unwillingness to pursue that knowledge, the unwillingness to challenge such immense limitations. That's where the accountability has to come in. You're not responsible for the trauma, but you're responsible for what you do with it, kind of a mindset. And we all know that. But unfortunately, we don't always find out the ways that trauma has affected our worldview, our behavior, and certainly our assumptions. And so my parents never really understood that the crazy, batshit crazy trauma they went through as kids, like next level shit, from being burnt to being beat to being put in closets to being forced to dress like a girl and stand out on the street. I mean, crazy shit. For them, they had come so far by not tying up their kids and leaving them in a closet that the idea of challenging how much it costs for people to go to college now never even crossed their mind. And I would like to propose that I think that's all right. I think I think we can understand how somebody might overlook what to them is way more subtle of information, right? Like their minds were being blown by the idea that you don't actually have to torment your children. That your children actually will respond to love and nurturing. That's where they were vibing. They were discovering that for the first time in their reality. And so fast forward all these years later, here I am almost 45 years old. I'm not sitting here judging my parents, being like, so these fucking redneck piece of shits, that's not what it's about. And people hear me telling these stories, and people, they mean it well. They'll make this kind of a comment. I've heard it a couple of times now of, you're still so angry, or you're just still so angry with God. I understand why they're saying that, and I know that they mean well. But this isn't anger. This is what everybody should be responding with to this level of stupid shit. We should not laugh about the level of trauma that we put children through in the name of a loving God. We have to stop trivializing that. We have to stop mocking that. It is causing deep, deep almost irreparable. I say almost because I have to believe anything can be repaired, but almost irreparable damage to children on an emotional level, on a psyche level, on every level, that then they go on and they scar and they hurt and it carries on over and over and over. And I've even gotten to the main key of this, so I need to get back to it. So I'm in 6th grade, I'm in Ms Dendy's class, I've just kind of come through an awakening, like I know what planet I'm on all of a sudden. And I'm wearing just these shit clothes, really horrible, faded out, holes in the jeans, holes in the patches in the jeans, shirts that are too short where, you know, you can see the top of my jeans and a little bit of my stomach, you know. And I remember getting very good. That's how I got on this track, talking about my dad. I remember getting very good at turning everything into a joke. I had a pair of shit blown out shoes that had been my brother's, and the front of the soles on both sides had come off, like were peeling off. So when I picked my foot up, it would be like flap, and it would do it on both sides, flap, 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 flap. And then I would go to school wearing that shit. And, you know, dragging them under me, tripping on it or whatever. And I did that for so long that I developed whole bits around it. I named each foot. They were my crocodiles, and that was what they would do. And I would sit in class and bounce my foot up and talk like a crocodile to kids, and kids would be laughing. And like, I learned how to turn it all into shtick. And I thank my dad for that. Yeah, I think that's a little sad. I wouldn't want my kids to have to do that, but I fucking survived it through humor. And there are certainly worse ways to survive it. And so I'm sitting in class one day, and man, I will never know what this fucking guy was doing. I want to just say right out the gate, I'll never know. But there was this dude that I'm pretty sure was a complete piece of shit named Clarence. And Clarence, and that was his real name. And if he hears it, cool, because I'm pretty sure he was being a piece of shit. But Clarence was that special kind of human that thrives on making you look like shit in front of people you care about. It's a special kind of bullying. Like, all right, you get the Bubba bully, like, I'm bigger than you, I'm going to hit you. All right, you know, there's a certain level of torment that goes with that, I admit, and I remember well. However, it's the bullies that are more into the fucking mind games, and Clarence's particular jam, because he could tell that I was kind of a quiet, shy, recluse, probably kind of weird out there kid, is he's the kind of guy that would like always try to make it look like I shit myself in front of some girl, or would walk by and yell fuck right in front of a school teacher, and she would turn around and he'd be like, Damien, I didn't do anything, but don't say that. You know, he was one of those guys. And I would freak out from that shit, mostly because I'm thinking that I'm going to get my ass beat, for the record. And it wasn't funny. And sometimes it really did get me in a lot of trouble. And because I was such a weird kid, and because I was raised in such a unrealistic house, my parents raised me the way they wanted the world to be, as Pentecostal prosperity, you know, word and faith healing Christians. They didn't raise me at all the way the world was, you know. And so I'm always saying to my kids, you know, this is the way we would wish the world was, and this is what we need to try to be, but this is also the way it is right now, and here's how you're going to have to deal with that. And so I didn't know how to handle this guy. He was always fucking with me. He was starting to get me in more and more trouble, so it was clearly a sport. It was going to escalate. And so I remember going up to him on the playground. 6th grade playground is less running and playing, more standing around and fucking torturing people. And I went up to him in front of a bunch of other guys, and I was like, Clarence, what's the deal, dude? Like, hey, I don't understand. I thought we were friends. I mean, can we be friends? It was one of those kind of things. And dude, they annihilated me. And at that point, you know, I had no idea. I had no idea that that's the worst thing in the world, especially all that, you know. Nobody was showing me how to handle this kind of a psychological bully. So the next day, Well, when I'm standing there and they're all laughing at me, it was one of these, they all start talking about, you know, my shoes and my clothes, and you're so fucking weird, dude. You're so fucking weird. Take your alligators, get the fuck out of here. What the fuck is wrong with you? You know, that kind of stuff. So I go home, I'm praying, I'm asking God to deliver me from this fucking evil demon named Clarence, who, you know, today's probably like got 3 kids and is an awesome dad and has no memory of this, right? So get up the next morning, put on my shit clothes, probably the same ones I wore the day before. Now, my mom always made sure my clothes were clean. We were not dirty poor. We weren't dirty poverty. My mom was an obsessive cleaner because of the abuse and shit she went through. So our house smelled like bleach and Comet all day, every day. And so my clothes were always clean. It was just the same clothes like every 2 days over and over, and they were tattered and worn out. So I put on my clothes. I go to school, and I remember Clarence comes walking in, and he's got like this grocery bag with him, and he sits down, and then he goes up, you know, and I'm watching Clarence the whole time because, you know, you watch the predator who's typically trying to kill you really closely. And I remember him going up and he's talking to Ms Dendy, and, you know, I later found out Ms Dendy was going through a divorce at this time, and so it makes a lot of sense because we watched a lot of movies and she really had like no shits. Not that she wasn't a good teacher, but that year in particular, she didn't want to put up with anybody's shit, man. And so I remember she was really stern, you know, but I liked her. But I see Ms Dendy looking at me, and then she looks at him with like this look like, "Aw." And then she looks at me, and I'm thinking, oh shit, what is he telling her, man? What is he possibly telling her? And she goes, okay. And she puts her hand on, you know, his shoulder, which I remember striking me because she wasn't like a really hands-on, handsy. She wasn't like a rah-rah, build everybody up. She was really going through hell at that time in her personal life. So anyway, she goes, class, everyone, put your pencils down. This was like later in the day, by the way. I jumped ahead. We have something really special, and I just think this is so cool. Damien, would you come up here? I'm like, oh, fuck. And Clarence is standing out there. And she's standing there, you know, she stood up. She's got her arm around him. This bag is sitting down. The bag of shit that he brought is sitting behind her desk. And she, like, come up here, and she puts her other arm. So she's between Clarence and I. And I know this already sounds like something written for TV, but I swear to God, this took place. Really no way for me to prove this one. I try to prove as many of these stories as I can. But she's like, Clarence came up, and you know what, Damien? He really wants to do something, and I think this is a great lesson for everyone. Clarence, why don't you just, why don't you just go ahead and make the presentation? And she backs up, so I'm standing there with Clarence, and he's like, you know, Damien, it seems to me like, you know, it's pretty obvious that you guys don't have a lot of money and that you're kind of poor. And he reaches over and gets the bag, and he's like, I just wanted to bring you all of my clothes so you can have these clothes, you know. I mean, they're my old clothes, but, I mean, I think they're still going to be better than your clothes. And he just hands me this bag, and this was the brown bag. We didn't have plastic bags yet. It was that crackly, you know. And it's just fucking full of his jeans and T-shirts and, like, a jacket. And, you know, the presentation was made in front of the entire fucking classroom, man. And so I just remember just an unbelievable amount of heat just like radiating off of my face. I can remember it being like a combination of shame, embarrassment, and just unbelievable rage. And because it's one of those deals that, especially when you're in 6th grade, there is no way that you could communicate to anybody. And I was smart enough to know that if I tried to explain it to everybody, it was all going to dissolve into just madness and shit. So I took the lump. I thanked him. I went and I sat down, put the bag down, you know, all the kids are looking over at you. And I remember Clarence, and I remember Ashley, and I remember Jennifer, and I remember all these people just kind of looking over at me and looked like, I have no idea what they were thinking, but they just kept staring at me, you know, and it was so bizarre. Then I had to walk home with that bag. Then I had to go home and show that bag to my parents. And you know what? It never crossed anybody's mind that that was shameful. It never crossed anybody's mind of how humiliating and how fucking horrible. You would never want your kids to experience that. Now listen, because I know people are assholes today, and there's just people that are just looking for the opposite of whatever you say. I grew up in this world. I'm speaking from experience. I have worked with people who've been in that situation. I grew up with many families that were in this situation. There is nothing wrong if you need to get secondhand clothes. And please, let's not forget, people like my wife, they prefer the secondhand clothes anyway. But that's a whole different thing. They have a choice. I don't like going into secondhand places because everybody I see in there, when you see the Mexican mama with the 7 kids and the black mama with the 2 kids, and you see the white lady with the 8 kids and all that, and you know, you could say that's wrong to say. I don't care. That was my experience. You can't say it's wrong. I experienced it. And what I'm telling you is they don't have a choice. And I'm in there, you know, with a choice. That makes me feel really gross. So I don't like doing that stuff. Well, it comes back from this. So I come home, and my parents are like, see, prosperity message. God just blessed us. God just blessed you, man. This is probably $150, which back then was more than $150 today. You know, it's $150, $170 worth of clothes, Damien. This is amazing. And it never, and for me at that point, honestly, I wouldn't say that I'm in shock. I just didn't know what was right. It just felt so horrible. But everybody else, not just my parents, but everybody else, my teacher, my friends in my classroom, everybody was acting like that was, you know, perfectly normal and that there was nothing wrong with it. And I can remember this being where I started developing that, I had had it before, but it started becoming really loud, where I would start getting this weird inner dialogue paranoia that would cycle. You know, you start turning on yourself of, well, everybody else thinks it's fine, so why do you have a problem with it? Well, I feel embarrassed. Well, that's a you problem. You know, what's the matter with you? What are you ashamed of? There's nothing wrong with them. The next day, I wear my old clothes. I'm not ready to wear Clarence's clothes to class. And Clarence goes up to me in the lunchroom, and I'm sitting there doing my thing, and he's like, hey, man, you're not going to wear my clothes? And he starts laughing. And all of his buddies over at the other table are laughing. He's like, hey, man, there's some good shit in there, right, bro? And he's laughing while we're talking about it. So he confirmed what I felt. But until he confirmed it, I really was starting to think that there was just something wrong with me. That my feeling was wrong. And I'll end this with this point. A big part of PTSD is when you get to a place where you doubt your intuition. And a lot of us have been there. People without PTSD have been there. I'm only speaking from my experience, is that a big part of religious trauma, and there are scientific studies. There's one a lot of you probably saw going around on social media within the last year, between 2019 and now 2020, of they're talking about how children that grow up in religious homes have a harder time holding on to reality. There are also studies where they're saying that children that grow up in super religious homes are more susceptible to things like dementia and when they're older. And they have proven that people grow up in extremely religious homes, which everyone escapes by going, well, I'm not extremely religious. We probably need to look at how to define that. Those children that are growing up where religion is the number one thing. So if you're a family where God is number one and you talk about it constantly, that's what they're referring to by extreme. That doesn't mean that you're wrong. I'm not judging you. I'm not saying change it. What I'm saying is that's what they're defining by extreme level of consciously talking about something, that thing that is on the forefront. Some families, it's sports. You got not just the dad, but the mom, the dad, and the kids, and it's every fucking sport, every season, every game, TV, radio, websites, apps, video games. You want to play a video game? Yeah, they're playing the same fucking sport. It's that. You're just that way with your belief system. It's not a judgment. But what they're starting to find out is that children that grow up in that extreme level of conversation, always in the foreground, and decision making and all that, as they get older, they are most definitely easier and more susceptible to suggestion, like straight up, like magic tricks. I went one time, and more than once, several times, to a hypnotherapist who was awesome, and it really helped me with some issues with my mom. Basically disconnected any emotions I had connected to the actual real physical abuse I had with my mom. I can still see it. I can still see the look on her face and the specifics that used to cause me so many emotional pains, but I don't feel the pain. And this guy disconnected that by putting me under and walking me through these exercises. But he said to me at the time, and this was before this study was out, this is before I was anywhere at the place where I'm at now. He said to me, you went under faster than just about anybody I've worked with in the last year. Now, this guy's been doing it for 30-something years. But he's like, my God, you go under. And every time I'd go in, he's like, you ready to begin? And I was out. Like, there you go. Do what you need. Because we are raised to doubt. We are raised to have this weird, twisted inner dialogue that's constantly at torment and war over whether we're making the right decision. And it forms this angst over everything. You know, I've said this before, and when I have Tammy, my ex-wife, on the podcast, I'm sure we'll talk about it. You know, a lot of us that got into the really, really, really extreme, stupid shit with all of this, you know, with all of the prosperity message and healings and demon chasing and all that. Those of us that got there, we got to the place where I remember Tammy praying about what earrings to wear to school. She would be praying and praying in tongues to make sure that we chose the right route, because there was 3 different routes we could take to school. And we wanted to make sure that we were taking the one that God wanted for us, because if we didn't, then we could get in a car accident. Maybe God's going to make sure we go a route where there's not a car accident, you know, blocking us. This is before we had, you know, GPS, much less on our phones and everything else. You know, and so it hits this stupid, crazy level. And for my family, when I came home with a bag full of bullies' fucking clothes and had just been publicly humiliated, and all the kids knew it, the teacher was the only one that didn't. They all got it. They understood it. For my parents to see that as a blessing, that created one of the biggest contradictions. And you'll hear me talk about this a lot. If I had to distill my life at this point down into a few small lessons for my kids, one of them most certainly would be the art of contradictions. When somebody's life is so fucking contradictory, what most of us do is we run from that person. And understandably so. I get that. I get that response. It's kind of a fight or flight. But the fight in this case is there's a lot that can be learned by studying a contradiction. And I was able, people ask me a lot how I was able to leave not just the church, but over time peel myself out of this ideology that was so entrenched in every aspect of my life and everything. How have I been able to remove that systematically? And this is one of the main ways. Is where there's a contradiction, you need to focus on that contradiction. In your life especially. You want to look at that. And that's what I started doing. My parents would preach prosperity. They would give money when we were broke. We were living off of people giving us money, and Christians say, well, that's God blessing. Look, again, I speak with authority and with experience when I say this. I lived that way. I experienced it. I am grateful, but there's other aspects that are going on here. And one of those aspects is typically it is broke people who can't pay their bills, who are giving money to broke people who can't pay their bills, who are giving money to broke people who can't pay their bills, who are giving their money to the church, who's then going to take some of that money, some of it, and give groceries to broke people. And it's this economy that's going around. And I have all kinds of feelings about that. I'm not even at the point where I'm going to say that right, wrong, that's not what this is about. But if you're going to raise your children calling that prosperity, then you need to be completely fucking stoner, chill, cool about it. Because my mom was always screaming and peeling the fucking skin off of her face from stress and screaming and yelling and tormenting our world and our life over this fucking thing called money. So I grew up hating money, hating it. Now, isn't it amazing how many broke ass people grow up and just get filthy fucking rich? I processed it in a weird way. I saw it turn the woman who, for whatever reasons, your mom really frames a massive part. There's chemicals, there's genetics, there's spirit, there's soul, there's behavior, there's all these things. Your mom, your dad, my mom, the maternal aspect of me, that person lived in hell. And the second biggest reason that was screamed about and yelled about and sarcastically jabbed about and mocked about was money. But we were living in a lifestyle of prosperity. So when the teaching, when the ideology isn't working, then you run into the next level of contradiction, and it's, are you going to double down or not? And this is what, I'll end on this, this is what ties all this together. The inability to learn to observe and look at your life circumstances as results of your choices, to see that you are getting more broke, you're about to get evicted, we would skip out on landlords multiple times when I was a kid. I have memories of us moving in the middle of the night, many memories of that kind of stuff, because we were having to bounce because my parents couldn't pay the rent. But then we would go to a church and we would dress up, and my parents would go to secondhand, stores and try to find the best looking suit and the best looking dress. And my mom would be bitter as fuck about it. And while I'm buying this shit, it smells like shit and da-da-da. But then we'd go to church in those clothes. So they're trying to look more prosperous than they are, not because they're trying to fit in. We were going to the equivalent of fairly country churches. They were in, shopping strips and shopping centers and that kind of thing, This wasn't bougie church. Nobody was driving fucking Mercedes. These were blue collar plumbers, electricians. They were the good, hard-working people, And so this idea that we're going to live by this standard called prosperity, but I'm going to allow that to be the torment of your life and scream and yell, that's a contradiction. So as a kid, I started looking at that, and I started realizing, and I remember times when we didn't have money for food, and my dad's always been, not always, but for most of my life, my dad has been a classic old school hand sign painter, but mostly on windows. But he'd do cars and trucks and anything. And we're broke. I mean, we're eating like one meal a day, and then we're eating like, oatmeal and shit like that at night. And sustaining life like that for a long time. And somebody calls my dad and offers him to paint, I want to say it was 6, so it was like 4 or 6 stores, and each one was going to be like $600 a piece. And at this point, I'm in like 7th, 8th grade. So, that was good money for then. And my dad prays about it and turns it down because they were bingo halls. And I can just remember sitting there being like, we don't have fucking groceries, man. Like, electricity is being turned off. We're going and hoping for these Holy Ghost handshakes. We're hoping for these bro moments. And I want to speak to that one dynamic. And this is going to be offensive to some people, and it's all right because it really is the truth. There's a culture in a lot of these kind of churches where people who mismanage their money, people who refuse to learn, to educate, to change their behavior, people will come to church. They'll bring their kids. They come in. You hear the car before you see the car. They come in and shit's falling off the car. It's clanging. It's banging. And there's, the dad is typically smiling ear to ear. These were the families I was growing up around at this time. The wife looks, stressed out of her mind. She's as dolled up as she can be. And they've got anywhere from 3 to 6 kids in the car. Back then, they weren't seatbelts. You just piled them in. And they all pour out of the shitty car. You can smell the car, and they come in and everybody's doing their best to put on airs, not even from a negative. I don't mean like they're trying to make us all think they're wealthy. They're trying to feel better about themselves and be what they think is presentable at a church. And it's honorable. And I think people misunderstand that. I think that really comes from I always saw it as more of a sweetness and a respect than we're trying to look like something. These aren't Visco girls. These are poor people who want to feel like they are at least showing that they understand and they're trying to be respectful. All right. So maybe you haven't experienced those folks, hard fucking working people. And hard working poor people tend to be susceptible to ideologies that are simplified and fast. And modern Christianity has mastered that. And when you can sum up everything that needs to be done in a few minutes, and then the people spend the rest of their lives trying to understand what they signed up for, it's a hell of a method, and it's very effective. They used to do it in malls where you'd walk through and all of a sudden some lady with a clipboard would catch you off guard. Excuse me. And you're like, huh? And they ask you a few questions and, you'd give them these responses. And then because they caught you off guard, they could get you to sign up. Hey, you had a great note there. Would you like to sign up for this monthly CD thing? Yeah, sure. Now you're paying $80 for, the best of smooth jazz and shit. I digress. The point is, in closing, is that the contradictions were always my way out. They became the stepping blocks. They became my way to get out of ideology. And you can do the same thing. Don't ignore contradictions. Anyone that wants to say in a conversation things like God's ways aren't our ways, we just aren't meant to understand, all of those kind of things, that is their right. There are people who believe that. And I respect that from one perspective. I respect it. I just don't think they go far enough with it. I think with all things, they're very lukewarm with it, to make a little Christian jab there. You need to commit, right? So completely commit to the fact that we have no fucking clue at all. Or commit to the fact that, yeah, we pretty much have a pretty solid idea. And so it was always been very frustrating for me in these contradictions where people just want to tap out and go, well, God's ways and our ways. Exactly. So mind your own fucking business, because there's a lot of things in the Bible that God didn't address, and where it is addressed, it's not fully addressed, and it's contradicted in other places. But here you are wanting to stone me over some shit. And then the minute I ask you about a contradiction that should require you getting your ass stoned, it's God's ways on our ways. Priests just molest kids. Fuck that. People keep hiding behind this shit. And we don't have to hide behind broken ideologies. I'm not saying don't believe in Jesus. I'm not saying don't go to church. I'm saying reclaim some personal responsibility that when you find a contradiction That contradiction has to be answered for, or you should not be following that ideology. You're teaching your kids a very, very dangerous approach to life. It's philosophical at first, and then it becomes absolutely the way they conduct their lives as adults. And it's simply this. We're going to put this idea, number one. We're going to make our lives about this one thing. This is the most important thing. Everything we need is encapsulated in this thing. You cannot add anything to this thing. This thing is perfect. It has never been marred. It is 100% flawless. You need to live your life according to it. When you don't, there are consequences for that sin. And of course, God gives you, forgiveness freely, but you came to this planet broken and fucked. And as long as that is the undertow, I say it all the time, as long as that's the undertow, then you're teaching your kids to undermine their own sense of understanding who they are, their own sense of right and wrong. That's why so many Christian kids, when they go off to college, they turn into fucking whores. Men, women, it doesn't matter. It's a fuck fest. And just 6 months before, they were at some camp or some retreat, speaking in tongues, slaying people in the spirit, purity rings and shit. It's because you didn't teach them. All you did was blind them. I can blind somebody from reality long enough and go, look, they're pure. They're pure. Oh my God, I kept them so pure. That's not something to fucking brag about. You're pumping out pure, confused, wide-eyed baby deers into the world, and then you wonder why they lose their goddamn mind, or they become addicts, or worse. So the contradiction around the prosperity and that it was okay for me to be humiliated because that's God's idea of prosperity, I never let that go. So from 6th grade on, that was the first time I had a major splinter in my conscience about the prosperity aspect of the church. And it just got worse from there. We drove around in a car without windows for like a year and a half. Dude, there are so many stories. I took a shower with the next door neighbor's water hose when they left. I would go out there with shampoo and soap because we had our water turned off for too long. Just crazy, weird, poor, stupid shit. And I actually tend to not want to tell these stories more because I feel like those are the stories that could be a little bit more embarrassing to my parents. And I try to tell them in a way that is as fair as possible. But at the same time, trauma is trauma. And mixing God and a God consciousness and all of these moral weights and triggers to us being poor was immensely traumatizing to me, as was being poor, as was, growing up with teeth, looked like somebody shoved like dynamite in a jack-o'-lantern. I mean, my lips would barely close over one of my teeth. It wasn't like I was bougie and, oh my God, I just never had veneers and it was so embarrassing. No, man, it was bad. And I grew up with that kind of shame. And you know what? Millions of people do. And we all get past it and we all move on. And most of us go, I really don't want my kids to experience that. And then we wind up spoiling our kids and the shit goes on and we roll on. So this isn't about, oh my God, how horrible it was that I didn't have braces. That's not what it's about. It was the combination of the confusion, the contradictions, the public embarrassment, and the ongoing need for me to learn two things. One, always be joking, always be deflecting, always be looking ahead to try and see where the fucking next Clarence is coming from, because there's fucking snipers and they're waiting, and you got to be ready and you got to be sharp and you got to be on your toes. And that's why I've always been able to slice a motherfucker's throat at a blink of an eye. All three of us kids, my brother, my sister, and I, we can, in a blink, unconscious, without movement, say a statement to a complete stranger that will cut them so deep it renders them fucking speechless. We've done it through our entire lives. And all three of us have grown to realize how horrible that is. And all of us really work to not do that. And for me, maybe once or twice a year, I lose my shit and I do it. And I'm reminded that I learned this. I learned how to be ready. I learned how to anticipate attack. I learned how to be, you never know when I want to come home. Is my mom leaving my dad today? Is she going to be screaming and yelling? Or is she going to be mad at my sister? Is she going to be slapping her, calling her a fucking idiot? Or is she going to be, watching Kenneth Copeland? Or is she going to be reading one of her books? Or is she going to be talking about one of her marriage books that she's writing? It was so fucking psycho all the time. I never knew what was going on. And as I became an adult, I carried all that shit in. And so I'm always battle ready. I'm always hot and ready, man, with loaded observations, judgments. That's why I've worked so hard to stop judging people. Nothing makes me feel worse at the end of a day than when I've had one of those days of, look at this fucking idiot. What the fuck? Look at this moron. Dude, it destroys your soul. So these contradictions, man, I have them on the healing things. I have them on the prosperity. I have them heavily on the demon side, and I will say everything for a long time came down to demonic forces. And while my dad was turning down work because we didn't want to glorify gambling and we were having to, borrow money or eat outdated food or whatever we were getting from the community centers and all that kind of stuff, which this day, a big part of me is very humbled, and it was amazing as an adult to look back and be the person receiving some of that. But these families that would show up at church, and we were one of those families, they kind of had a reputation of always needing money. So anytime there was a prayer request, it was, hey, we're just praying, we really got to make the rent. And then you go through church, and then there's all the other services, and then someone comes up and gives you money. Everybody's benefiting from that. But we were told that God was giving them a word. Well, no, you literally just stood up like an hour ago and asked for money. But we were taught that it was a supernatural thing, like God spoke to somebody and was like, go give that person money. There was always just really weird, distorted shit. And the only way I could get out of it was contradictions, man.
Love this episode of Spiritual PTSD Podcast? Head over to iTunes, Spotify, or Google to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. It's really helpful this early on in our podcast journey. And of course, don't forget to check out our website, spiritualptsd.com, for full interviews, event updates, and to join the conversation. Thank you. The opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and their guest. All facts and information has been stated as the host and their guest experience them and should not serve as a historical portrayal.